The blind date was empty, until a little girl walked in and said, "My mommy's sorry she's late." It was one of those late afternoons where the city lights began to wake, shimmering through the tall glass windows of Bellerose, an upscale restaurant nestled in the heart of downtown. The tables were filled with murmurs of laughter, clinks of silverware, and the low hum of jazz floating from hidden speakers. At a corner table, elegantly set for two, sat Graham Hale. He was the kind of man who wore time like a uniform. Crisp white shirt, tailored gray tie, cuffs aligned perfectly above his wristwatch, a timepiece that cost more than most people's monthly rent. But it was not about the money. It was about precision, control, discipline. He sat still, eyes flickering once again to the screen of his phone. No new messages. He pressed his lips into a thin line, then turned his wrist and glanced at the dial of his watch. 17 minutes past the hour. His jaw flexed. He hated lateness. Not because of inconvenience, but because it reminded him of something else, a feeling of being overlooked, forgotten. A child waiting on a doorstep that never opened. He pushed his chair back, the legs sliding smoothly against the marble floor. The maitre d' saw him begin to rise and approached, but Graham lifted a hand lightly, not now. Then it happened. A small figure darted between the legs of a waiter and a passing couple. A blur of blonde curls, pink shoes, and determined little steps. She ran straight toward him, uninvited, uninhibited. She clutched at his pant leg with tiny fingers and looked up, cheeks flushed from the run, blue eyes wide with urgency. "My mommy's sorry she's late," the little girl said, slightly breathless, as if this apology had been rehearsed and meant the world to deliver. Graham froze. For the first time in a very long while, he did not know what to say. The restaurant blurred for a moment. All the precision in his world, the ticking watch, the measured tone of jazz, the rhythm of his structured life, paused. He looked down at her. She was maybe 3. A wisp of a child, wearing a denim jumper over a yellow t-shirt. One sock slightly slouched, the other perfectly in place. A tiny silver barrette held a strand of hair to the side, but the rest was a tousled halo. And those eyes, honest, expectant. His lips parted. What? She said to say that. The girl repeated, firmer now, as if she feared he had not heard her clearly. "Mommy said she's really, really sorry." She tugged again at his pant leg and gestured to the empty chair across from him. "That's for her, right?" Graham slowly lowered himself back into the seat, not taking his eyes off her. Something inside him, something old and quietly wounded, stirred. He had been the boy once, sitting on a cold step with a backpack waiting, telling himself stories about why someone was late, why they forgot. He had built an empire to never feel that way again. And now, this small girl, this child with chubby hands and serious eyes, had taken him right back to that doorstep. Except she had come to deliver the message he never got. A voice called out from behind, "Maisie, Maisie, honey." A woman hurried into view, breath-catching, heels clicking unevenly. "I told you to wait by the door?" Graham looked up. There she was, blonde hair escaping a low bun, face flushed with embarrassment. She wore a simple navy dress and carried a tote bag that looked far too heavy for one shoulder. Her eyes met his, and for a moment she hesitated. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice warm but rushed, wrapping her arms protectively around the child. She insisted on finding you." The little girl beamed. "I did it, Mommy. I told him." The woman laughed softly, then looked at Graham again. Lila Monroe," she said, extending a hand. He shook it instinctively. Her grip was firm, honest, no pretenses, no gloss. Graham Hale. A flicker of something crossed her face. She had heard the name, most people had, but she did not mention it. Instead, she turned to her daughter. "Maisie, can you say sorry for running off?" Maisie nodded dutifully. "Sorry, Mr. Graham." Graham blinked. "It's okay," he said, almost too quietly. The maitre d' arrived, unsure whether to intervene or serve. Graham lifted a hand slightly. They were staying. As the two sat down, Graham noticed the way Lila smoothed Maisie's hair before placing her gently on a booster seat. Every movement was calm, full of care. She adjusted her own chair with a quiet apology and exhaled deeply just once. For the first time in a long time, Graham Hale didn't mind the time, and he certainly wasn't thinking of leaving anymore. Lila Monroe sat across from him, still catching her breath, strands of golden hair slipping from the loose bun at the nape of her neck. The sleeves of her dress were slightly creased, and her cheeks still held a faint flush from rushing. "I'm sorry," she said again, this time softer, looking directly into Graham's eyes. "There was a man who collapsed near the subway. I had to help." Her voice held no performance, no dramatics, just the simple weight of a truth she did not seem to think needed defending. Graham stared at her, the usual script in his mind failing to cue. He had expected excuses. He had expected something about traffic, a forgotten item, a call from work. He had not expected this. She reached down to adjust Maisie's sandal, her hand lingering for a second on her daughter's ankle, then straightened up. Her dress was plain, navy blue with a faded hem. No jewelry, not even a watch. But there was something in the way she carried herself. Steady, present. Graham tilted his head slightly, regarding her. "Most people don't stop." Lila shrugged lightly. "Most people assume someone else will." There it was again, that quiet conviction. He didn't know what surprised him more. The fact that she had stopped for a stranger, or the way she spoke about it, like it was the most normal thing in the world. "It took longer than I thought," she added. "The ambulance was late, and, well, Maisie insisted we still come." "I'm glad you did," Graham said, almost before realizing he had said it. Maisie giggled and waved at a passing waiter. "Mommy makes boo-boos feel better." Lila smiled at her daughter, then turned her attention back to Graham. "I hope you weren't waiting too long." He hesitated. 17 minutes. Her smile faltered for a split second. "That's pretty long." Graham nodded, but then surprised even himself by adding, "It's fine." Something about the sincerity in her apology, not defensive, not overdone, softened the tension he always held around lateness. In his world, every second was $1. Every delay was a crack in the system. But this woman had chosen a stranger's life over punctuality. That unsettled something deep in him. He glanced toward the door, where the maitre d' had initially hovered earlier, now out of sight. He could have walked away. By all logic, he should have. But logic wasn't running the show anymore. Not tonight. "You said he collapsed?" Graham asked. Lila nodded. "I didn't know what happened. He just crumpled." People kept walking around him. Some stared, but no one stopped. "So you did." "I didn't think twice," she said simply. "Maisie held my bag while I stayed with him until someone called 911. Graham studied her. The warmth in her eyes contrasted so sharply with the cool efficiency he was used to. The people in his world moved quickly, talked fast, shook hands with masks on. But here was someone who didn't even own a mask to wear. Maisie reached across the table and grabbed a sugar packet, fiddling with it before Lila gently took it from her. "Sorry," she said. "We're usually more organized." Graham offered a rare smile. "It's okay." He noticed the way Lila's shoulders relaxed slightly, like she had expected this dinner to be a trial, and perhaps it still would be. But for now, the tone had shifted. "Thank you for still coming," he added, his voice lower. Lila looked at him, curious. "Did you think I wouldn't?" "I thought you might decide it wasn't worth it." She considered that. "If I didn't think it was worth it, I wouldn't have come at all." Graham leaned back slightly, something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Admiration, maybe. Or something quieter, deeper, something he hadn't let in for a long time. "I had to help." That sentence repeated itself in his mind. People were late for selfish reasons. People missed things because they forgot, because they didn't care. But she had been late because she chose someone else over herself. He did not want to leave anymore. Not even close. The waiter returned with a high chair, and Maisie climbed into it with the confidence of someone who had dined in the world's finest establishments, or at least believed she had. She swung her little legs happily and grabbed the corner of the menu, even though she couldn't read a word of it. Graham watched her with quiet amusement, then turned to Lila. "Is grilled cheese okay?" Before she could answer, Maisie piped up, "I love grilled everything." Lila laughed, a soft, melodic sound that made Graham's shoulders lower an inch. "She's not exaggerating," she said. "If it has cheese and grill marks, we're in." Graham gave a small nod to the waiter. "3 orders then, 1 grilled cheese, 1 seared salmon, and a pasta with no herbs or green things," he said, glancing at Maisie, who grinned in approval. "You've done this before," Lila said, her brows raised. He smirked. "Not exactly, but I learned fast." The conversation began with slow, polite exchanges. Where they lived, what they did, the kind of small talk that usually felt forced. But something about this evening made it different. Maybe it was the way Maisie occasionally chimed in with wide-eyed comments about things like clouds shaped like elephants. Or maybe it was the way Lila leaned forward when she listened, genuinely interested in what Graham had to say. For the first time in years, he wasn't running through a checklist of red flags or compatibility metrics in his mind. He was just present. Then, mid-sentence, it happened. Maisie reached for her juice with a little too much enthusiasm, and the glass tipped sideways, spilling cold water straight into Lila's lap. Lila gasped softly and instinctively pushed back her chair. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she started, fumbling for a napkin. But Graham was already moving. With one smooth motion, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a perfectly folded cloth handkerchief. He leaned over, carefully dabbing at the fabric of her dress, just above the knee. Not invasive, not hurried, just gentle, efficient, precise. Lila stilled. For a beat, neither of them moved. His hand paused mid-motion. She looked at him, really looked at him, and something shifted. The air around them grew softer, quieter, as if the restaurant, with all its soft music and flickering candles, had faded into the background. Their eyes met. "You're not what I expected," she said quietly, a bit breathless. Graham looked at her, then slowly withdrew his hand, folding the cloth back with care. "Neither are you." She smiled, but it held something deeper, a mix of gratitude, surprise, and maybe even vulnerability. "Most men don't carry handkerchiefs anymore," she added. "I'm not most men." "That much," she said, glancing down at the now damp hem of her dress, "is very clear." Maisie, oblivious to the emotional current passing between them, resumed happily munching on a breadstick. Lila turned to her daughter, brushing a crumb off her chin. Then, more softly, to Graham. "Thank you. That was unexpectedly kind." "It wasn't anything," he said, though it clearly had been. It had been a moment where something unspoken passed between two people from very different worlds, a connection made not from grand gestures or perfectly timed lines, but from an ordinary act of thoughtfulness. For the rest of the meal, the conversation flowed more easily. Lila spoke about the bookstore she worked at during the day, the smell of old paper, how Maisie would curl up in the reading corner while she stacked shelves. Graham shared little anecdotes from the tech world, stories usually reserved for boardrooms or silent dinners with investors, but somehow he found himself wanting her to know. Maisie occasionally interrupted with observations about dogs she had seen or stories from preschool. Each time she spoke, Graham leaned in, genuinely listening. The cold steel atmosphere of Bellerose, all glass, silver, and whispered etiquette, slowly transformed around them. It no longer felt like a first date, arranged by chance. It felt like the beginning of something warm. The evening breeze had picked up by the time they stepped out of the restaurant. The city lights glowed softly above, reflected in passing car windows and the wet sheen of the pavement. Graham reached into his coat pocket, adjusting his keys. "I'll drive you home," he offered, nodding toward the sleek black car parked just across the street. "It's late, and the city's not exactly charming at night. Lila gave a gentle laugh, shifting Maisie to her other hip. Thank you, but we take the bus. Graham blinked. The bus? Maisie loves it, she said with a smile, brushing a curl from her daughter's forehead. She waves at every person she sees through the window. It's her evening tradition. Maisie perked up, clearly energized despite the hour. And Mommy lets me sit by the window if no one else needs it. Graham hesitated. He was used to offering things, rides, upgrades, solutions. And he was even more used to people accepting them quickly, sometimes before he finished the sentence. But not Lila. Her voice held no pride, no challenge, just a quiet assurance that their way of getting home was enough. They began walking together toward the nearby bus stop, Graham falling into step beside them. The sidewalk was cracked in places, and Maisie pointed out a flower growing through a gap. Lila knelt beside her to admire it like it was a painting in a gallery. Do you live far? Graham asked after a pause. Not really. 15 minutes by bus. We rent a small place near the library. Graham looked over. Do you work there? At the library? No, she said. I work part-time at the bookstore across the street from it. It's quiet, and they let me bring Maisie sometimes. I also wait tables a few nights a week. He glanced at her, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't explaining herself. She was just sharing. The weight of that struck him more than he expected. You're busy, he said. I try to be, she replied. Bills don't pay themselves, and Maisie thinks food magically appears, so I try to keep the illusion alive. Graham chuckled. He wasn't sure if it was her honesty or the way she said it with such ease, but something about her made the world feel less transactional. He hesitated. Do you ever think about doing something else? Sure, she replied. Don't we all? But right now, this is where I am. And honestly, it's not bad. I get to read to my daughter, work with books, and meet strangers who sometimes become friends. There was no trace of bitterness in her voice. No hint of, if only, just presence. You're not bothered? He asked. By how hard it is? Lila looked at him then, really looked. Life's hard for everyone, in different ways, Graham. I just try to make sure it doesn't make me hard in return. They stopped at the bus stop. A breeze stirred the hem of her dress. She adjusted Maisie's jacket and added quietly, Kindness is what I want Maisie to remember, not how fancy our dinner was. The words hit him like a quiet wave, soft but unstoppable. He had grown up thinking success was armor. The more of it you wore, the less the world could hurt you. But in front of him stood a woman with no armor at all. No wealth, no connections, no backup plan, just love and quiet resolve. And suddenly, all his polished routines and bulletproof strategies felt small. He looked at her, then at Maisie, now humming to herself while swinging her feet. And for the first time in years, Graham Hale, tech magnate, control freak, perfectionist, didn't feel superior. He felt humbled. There were no more reservations, no formal dinners or name cards on crisp white linens. From that night on, their meetings were simple, unplanned, but somehow they mattered more. They met on park benches, surrounded by duck ponds and ice cream trucks. Sometimes it was a corner table in the cozy cafe 2 blocks from Lila's apartment, where Maisie would color on napkins while Lila and Graham sipped lukewarm coffee. Other times, it was the quiet back aisle of the used bookstore where Lila worked, the one that always smelled like old pages and cinnamon tea. There were no scripts to follow, no performances, just conversations and silences that didn't need to be filled. One Saturday morning, Graham showed up at the bookstore with a paper bag under his arm. For Maisie, he said, offering it to Lila. She opened it carefully, eyes widening as she pulled out a collection of classic fairy tales, hardcovers, illustrated, some with gilded edges, not new, but well-loved, carefully chosen. She's been asking about Cinderella, he said, and I thought maybe Snow White could balance it out. Lila smiled and blinked fast. That's incredibly kind. She mentioned she likes dragons, he added, almost shyly. There's one in here somewhere. Maisie squealed when she saw the books. Are they mine? Forever? Yes, Graham replied. But you have to promise to share them with your mommy. I will, she said solemnly, hugging the stack to her chest. Later that afternoon, they sat together in the park. Graham had never read out loud to anyone before, but there he was, cross-legged on the grass, holding an open book while Maisie leaned against his side, her fingers tracing the pictures. He stumbled over a voice for the fairy godmother, and Maisie burst into laughter. You sound like a robot? I am a robot, he deadpanned. Fairy protocol activated. Lila watched from a short distance, sipping tea from a paper cup, her smile soft and steady. As the sun began to lower, Graham helped Maisie into her shoes. She'd kicked them off during a pretend tea party with imaginary woodland animals. He didn't say anything as he found them under a tree, dusted them off, and placed them back by her feet. Left to the left, right to the right, neatly aligned. Lila saw the gesture. She said nothing then, but her chest ached in the best way. Later that week, she asked him, Why do you do all this? Graham shrugged. You're the only people I look forward to seeing. That evening, as Lila put Maisie to bed, she found herself whispering, We're not just visitors in his world, are we? Maisie mumbled, half asleep, He's our forever friend. And somehow, that felt truer than anything. They stopped calling it dating. It didn't need a label. It was lunch on curbs, silly faces during errands, shared laughter over burnt toast, and quiet moments where Graham looked at them like he'd finally come home. One rainy morning, a small group gathered at the local library for a community reading event. Lila and Maisie arrived early, and the librarian greeted them with a warm smile. There's something you should see, she said, gesturing toward a new plaque above the children's corner. Lila stepped closer. The gold letters were etched simply, but they held so much. Donated with gratitude. By a friend. For the woman who makes time for strangers, and the girl who makes me smile. L&M, reading nook. Her hand flew to her mouth. Maisie tugged at her coat. Mommy? That's us. Lila blinked back tears. Yes, baby. That's us. She turned and caught sight of Graham standing at the far end of the library, watching them with a soft, almost bashful expression. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The gesture was louder than any declaration. He wasn't just showing up anymore. He was staying. It happened on a Wednesday morning. The sun hadn't even cleared the rooftops when Lila's phone buzzed with 3 unread messages. Then 5. Then 12. Her hands trembled as she opened the first link. There it was, bold, unmissable, plastered across a gossip site's homepage. Tech giant, dating waitress with kid, secret romance or charity case. The photos were grainy but unmistakable. Graham crouching beside Maisie at the bookstore, Lila laughing as they crossed the street, her hand lightly on his arm. A private moment turned public without permission. She felt her stomach drop. Scrolling further, she read the speculative captions. Some praised Graham's humanitarian heart. Others accused him of using the flunders. Her hand flew to her mouth. Maisie tugged at her coat. Mommy? That's us. Lila blinked back tears. Yes, baby. That's us. She turned and caught sight of Graham standing at the far end of the library, watching them with a soft, almost bashful expression. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The gesture was louder than any declaration. He wasn't just showing up anymore. He was staying. It happened on a Wednesday morning. The sun hadn't even cleared the rooftops when Lila's phone buzzed with 3 unread messages. Then 5. Then 12. Her hands trembled as she opened the first link. There it was, bold, unmissable, plastered across a gossip site's homepage. Tech giant, dating waitress with kid, secret romance or charity case. The photos were grainy but unmistakable. Graham crouching beside Maisie at the bookstore, Lila laughing as they crossed the street, her hand lightly on his arm. A private moment turned public without permission. She felt her stomach drop. Scrolling further, she read the speculative captions. Some praised Graham's humanitarian heart. Others accused him of using the Flunders. "That's not how I see you," he said, stepping forward. "I'm not a store you rescue," she snapped, tears rising. "I'm someone trying her best." Silence. Graham looked at her, then at the small pink raincoat hanging on the hook near the door. He exhaled slowly. "I didn't want this either," he said, "not like this." Lila wiped her cheek. "Then maybe you should go." From the hallway, Maisie's voice called out softly, "Mommy, is he not coming anymore?" The question cracked something in Lila's chest. Graham turned toward the sound, but stopped himself. He looked at Lila one last time, her guarded stance, her trembling hands, her heart pressed between survival and pride. He nodded once, then walked away. No speeches, no promises, just the soft click of the door closing behind him. 3 days passed. Lila didn't text. Graham didn't call. The world spun on, fast and loud, but inside Lila's small apartment, everything was quiet. Too quiet. Maisie had stopped asking where Graham was after the second night, though Lila could see it in her eyes, the wondering, the waiting. On the third evening, just as dusk crept through the blinds, there was a knock at the door. Lila froze in place. For a moment, she didn't move. Then she stood, heart pounding, and walked slowly toward it. When she opened the door, there he was. Graham Hale, without his usual armor. No sleek car behind him, no tailored suit. Just jeans, a worn sweatshirt, and messy hair that looked like he hadn't slept much. In each of his arms was a grocery bag, plastic, crinkled, and filled with dollar store snacks. He lifted one slightly. Ramen noodles, chicken-flavored, the spicy kind you like. He lifted the other. Popcorn, microwavable, and a chocolate bar that says it might be real cocoa but probably isn't. Lila blinked, speechless. Graham took a breath and looked her in the eye. "I'm not here as a CEO. I'm not here with statements or damage control or solutions." His voice was quieter now, steady but raw. "I'm just a man who'd rather sit on your couch than at any boardroom table." From behind Lila, a small voice called out, "Mr. Graham?" Maisie appeared in the doorway, pajama-clad and barefoot. She held something small and folded in her hand. She walked up and offered it to him. "This is yours," she said. "Mommy washed it." Graham looked down and unfolded the cloth. It was the handkerchief, his handkerchief. The same one he had used that night in the restaurant. Carefully folded now. Soft and clean. His throat tightened. "Thank you," he whispered, bending down to meet her eyes. Maisie looked up at him, serious. "Can you stay this time?" Lila turned away, covering her face with one hand. She didn't want to cry. Not again. Not in front of Maisie. But the tears came anyway. Graham stood and stepped forward, slowly, gently, not trying to fix it, not trying to explain. He just stood with her. "I don't care what the headlines say," he said, voice thick with emotion. "I care about what you think when I knock on this door. I care about her smile when I show up. I care that you feel seen, not saved, just seen." Lila lowered her hand, her eyes red. "You really bought ramen?" He nodded. "Chocolate too." She laughed, a wet, broken laugh, and nodded toward the kitchen. "Then, I guess you're staying for dinner." Graham exhaled in relief. Maisie tugged on his sleeve. "We can watch cartoons after we eat, but only if you like dragons." Graham grinned. "I love dragons." Lila stood in the doorway a moment longer, watching the two of them walk to the kitchen, their voices already merging with the hum of the microwave. And just like that, the silence in her apartment began to fade. He had come back, not as someone perfect, not as someone powerful, but as someone who stayed. It was a Sunday morning, touched with gold. The air was crisp, the kind that hinted at fall just around the edges. Leaves whispered in the breeze as they fluttered down to the sidewalk. The city was quiet, resting between weekday rushes and afternoon errands. And there they were, the three of them, walking side by side down a tree-lined path toward the park. Graham held a small paper bag in one hand, filled with cinnamon rolls from a corner bakery. Lila carried a travel mug of tea, her free hand tucked loosely into her jacket pocket. Maisie skipped ahead, chalk clutched tightly in her fingers, her curls bouncing with every step. There was no need for conversation. The silence was the good kind, the kind that only settles in when people feel safe. At the entrance to the park, Maisie paused and dropped to the ground beside the concrete walkway. She knelt on both knees, pulled out her chalk, and began to draw. Lila and Graham watched as colors bloomed beneath her hands: blue, pink, yellow, and green. The shapes were simple but clear. 3 stick figures stood in a row, one tall, one medium, one tiny, with a swirl of blonde chalk for hair. Above them, in crooked, slanted letters, she scrawled, "My family." Graham stared at it. Something in his chest expanded slowly, painfully, beautifully. Lila looked at him, her eyes shining in the morning light. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Graham stepped closer to her. He took the mug from her hands and set it gently on the nearby bench. Then he turned, took a breath, and dropped to one knee on the sun-warmed pavement beside the drawing. There was no ring box, no big speech. Just his eyes meeting hers, steady and clear. "Can I stay?" he said softly. "For every late moment of your life." Lila's breath caught. Maisie looked up, a chalk smear on her cheek. "Does that mean you live with us now?" Graham smiled at her, then turned back to Lila. "Only if your mommy says yes." Lila stepped forward, bent down, and cupped his face in both hands. "You already stayed through the worst," she whispered. "Of course you can stay for the rest." She kissed his forehead, and he closed his eyes, as if sealing the moment into memory. Maisie clapped her chalk-stained hands. "Yay! Can we have pancakes every Saturday now?" Graham laughed. "Deal, but only if you help flip them." "I'm very good at flipping," Maisie declared with utmost confidence. Lila stood and offered Graham her hand. He took it, standing with her, brushing dust from his jeans. Together, they turned back down the path. Lila on one side, Graham on the other, Maisie between them. They walked slowly. 3 shadows stretched across the pavement. 3 hands held tight. 3 hearts, different but whole. Stitched together not by blood, but by choice.